Hi, so today we're going to talk about the 8 characteristics of life, and these are the 8 things that all living things or organisms, well, all living things or organisms have in common. So basically, in order to be considered living by a scientist, you have to have 8 different characteristics. We're going to go through all 8 of these, but first, just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going with this, there are actually little tips to help you remember all of them. The first letter of each of these 8 characteristics, when you put all those first letters together, it spells out Mrs. Cnerg. So we're going to go through each of these letters, and that will help you memorize what the 8 characteristics of life are. Let's go ahead and start. Okay, so the very first thing that all living things have in common is they are able to have movement. So all living things are able to move. You might think that it's pretty obvious that animals and other types of organisms can move. Oh, and just so that we remember what our big picture is here. But even things that you might not consider very active are also moving too, because they're considered alive. For example, you have plants. Now, plants actually do move, but they move so slowly that we usually don't realize it. For example, plants can move towards or away from sunlight or shade. So plants obviously want to grow towards the sun, and so they actually do move. And if you watched a plant over a very long period of time and then fast forward it, you would see how a plant does really grow towards the sun, and most of the time it grows away from the shade. The next characteristic of life that all living things have in common is that they're able to do something called respiration. So respiration is basically breathing. All living things are able to breathe in some way, but actually we don't want to say breathing because that really sounds like something that humans and animals do, and I wouldn't really say that a plant can breathe. But what is happening though is that when you are doing respiration, you are exchanging gases, or you could just say exchanging gas with the environment. So let me tell you what I mean by that exactly. Oh, we're not in a room. So, for example, humans, what we do is we breathe in oxygen. So we take oxygen from the air around us, which oxygen we're going to rate as O2, and we're basically going to trade that inside of our bodies with carbon dioxide that we breathe out. So we breathe in oxygen from the air, and when we breathe it in, we have to breathe out a gas that we make in our own bodies, and we're going to breathe out carbon dioxide, and we're basically trading or exchanging those gases, because these are both gases, we're trading those gases with whatever the environment has outside of our bodies. Something you might want to keep in mind is that not every gas in respiration is going to be oxygen and carbon dioxide. You've got to keep in mind the weird living organisms that we don't usually think about. Things like bacteria. Some bacteria actually breathe in very, very strange gases. So bacteria can still do respiration because they're still trading those gases with the environment, but sometimes those gases might be things that you might not have heard about. For example, sulfur or other strange chemicals that they breathe in and out, but they're still trading a gas with the environment. The next living characteristic that we're going to discuss is a living thing's ability to be sensitive or have sensitivity with their environment. Basically, what I mean by this is that living things are able to react to their surroundings. Living things are sensitive and they're able to react to their surroundings or to their environment. Use that word environment again. So if you're alive, you have to be able to tell what's going on around you. Here's a really great example of this. Let's say that it's really, really cold outside. So it's a cold winter's day, especially if you're from Chicago, where I'm from, and it is just snowing outside. So there's snow on the ground, and you're even able to build a snowman. It's so cold. That does not really look like a snowman, but we'll work with it. So it's really, really cold. So then as a person, since you're a living organism, you're definitely going to be able to tell that it's really cold outside because you're sensitive to your environment in the cold. And so you might say something like, "Brr, it's really, really chilly in here." So that's an example of how you might be sensitive to your environment because you're reacting to how cold it is. So now let's move along to the next letter in Mrs. Cnerg. Remember, so far we've done movement, we've done respiration and sensitivity, and now we're going to talk about how all living things are made of cells. We've talked a lot about cells in class, all sorts of different types of cells. We've talked about eukaryotic cells that have a nucleus. We've talked about prokaryotic cells that just have free-floating DNA. No matter what type of cell you're made out of, all living things are made of cells. The cell is the smallest living thing that we can still say is alive. So as long as you know that, you're pretty good. Next, we have all living things need nutrition. So what nutrition basically means is you need food, and food gives you energy. So nutrition has everything to do with food and energy. Nutrition also kind of sounds like the word nutrients, and that's because those two words come from each other. So nutrition is the way that you get your nutrients. So again, whether this means that you are a plant who's getting its nutrients by growing towards the sun, or whether you are a fungi, a little mushroom, who's getting its nutrients by breaking down dead things, like a dead leaf or dead logs in the ground, that is your way of getting, getting nutrition. So there you go, nutrition. All living things also, because when you're alive, you're using up your energy and you're also creating garbage. So we create garbage all the time. When living things create garbage inside of their bodies or wastes inside of their bodies that they need to get rid of, we call that excretion. So basically, excretion is kind of just a nice, polite, scientific way to say that you need to get rid of the waste that you've created in your body, and for a lot of us, that just means that we need to use the bathroom. So this is a little toilet that I've drawn for you to kind of remember that. But excretion isn't always about going to the bathroom. Sometimes excretion can also include when you are sweating. So, for example, if we have someone who's really overheating, you might see little drops of water on their face or on their body, and that's the sweat. That's your body's way of excreting that waste. And sweat is an example of excretion. That's something, anything that you're getting rid of or letting out is an example of excretion. You're getting rid of the garbage that your body does not need, but it has produced. We also have something called reproduction. And reproduction is another thing that all living organisms have in common. And reproduction is the ability to have babies. So, Of course, babies doesn't sound very professional or scientific, so a better word that we're going to use for reproduction is not to have babies, but to have offspring. So babies, basically, babies means offspring. Not just humans can have offspring, so can plants. The little seeds that plants create, those are offspring because those will eventually grow into a new plant. Another thing that can have offspring that you might not realize are bacteria. So if you have one bacteria, this bacteria can actually split into two bacteria. These two bacteria are now the offspring of the parent. So this is all an example of how living things can reproduce or show the characteristic of reproduction. Reproduction. To produce again. Production means to make the offspring, and then means to do it over again. So when you create another one of yourself. Finally, the last characteristic of life is growth. So all living things need to be able to grow or develop over time, just like the way that you've grown from the time that you were a little tiny baby. Oops, that kind of looks like an apple. There you go. From the time that you were a little baby to now you are a young adult and you are a teenager. So you've been able to grow over time just in the same way that bacteria have been able to grow over time to get bigger and bigger, or just to make more and more of themselves. All living things need to be able to grow. So those are the 8 characteristics of life. Let's just review really quickly all the different parts of Mrs. Cnerg. So Mrs. Cnerg, remember, includes movement, respiration, sensitivity, reacting to your environment. The C stands for all living things are made of cells. The N is all living things need nutrition. All living things need to be able to excrete wastes or get rid of their wastes. The second R stands for reproduction, being able to make offspring. And the G stands for growth. So just so that you have a practice question, you might get questions, for example, that say, a fire can spread and create new fires. Fire can spread and create new fires, new little fires. This sounds like it could be, this sounds like it could be reproduction. Is a fire alive because it can do reproduction? Why is a fire alive or not? And then you would have to give me evidence using your other 8 characteristics of life to prove to me that just because a fire can create more little fires, more new fires, and this might seem like reproduction, you have to tell me what are some other characteristics of life that a fire cannot do, to prove to me that the answer to this question is no. So you need to say no, and you need to give me some evidence. Go ahead and try that out for some practice.